So glad to have you. I'm gonna walk here while you're coming in to the kitchen because I'm cooking some dinner for my son and got to get that going. It's literally just got to put it in the oven. Don't worry, I'm not gonna be like mixing up a serious recipe here. Um, but I will have to take a 5 minute intermission in the middle of all this to make a salad. Uh, just one of those, multiple juggle moments of cooking and wouldn't have it any other way, actually. Love being a dad to this guy. And also really, really, really treasure being able to teach with you all. So I'm on my way. I'm going to be heading over towards the office in just a second, just checking the ingredients, the teaching here. So it's 375. Awesome. That's where we want to go. Temperature wise. Perfect. Got to put it in the oven now. Nothing like making a little omelet that was already made. And now it's just getting warmed up. But in my view, that's called cooking. Okay, so let's see how long we cook this for. Cook it for 65 minutes. Awesome. All right. See, this is where it helps to have your lecture all ready to go. So as soon as I get back over there, I'm going to be in position to kick off this puppy. So I hope you're all doing great tonight. It's been a really good day for me, actually. Just been crazy the last hour or so. Just came off a Zoom with actually 30 plus educators who are going on our next learning tour with us from all over the country. And they're amazing. And we were doing introductions around the room. And I didn't want to cut those off. Didn't feel good about that. And so I just said, hey, you know what? I'm going to come a minute or two late to the lecture. And I appreciate you all very much for rolling with that. So welcome tonight to the lecture. This is lecture 2 in, of course, the series Lost Cause Politics. And the focus of tonight is going to be the period of time from the Civil War through George Wallace. So let me go ahead and share here. Thank you all so much. Let me change my name here too. Wait. Come on. Let's go back over here. This is lecture 2 in this 3-part course. This one is the middle ground, the period of time from the Civil War through George Wallace. And we will get to the final piece. Which will be Donald Trump and MAGA Nation at the end. Where did I go? Where did I go with that? I had some water here. Oh, here it is. Right here. So I want to start with what I'm going to call Southern Resurrection, because in the narrative, that narrative that I talked about here, there is the equivalencies between Christianity and the narrative of Christianity and the narrative of the lost cause. And in both of them, there is a resurrection. And so the Southern resurrection, and we really need to think about the kind of lost cause mindset through this very intricately bound and woven together narrative. So the Southern resurrection is proof of the authenticity, the correctness of the narrative to those who are living it out. And that resurrection begins after the Civil War, when they begin to reclaim their identity and to build the lost cause. And then it really gets trumpeted in the beginning of what's called the New South. And the New South, like the New Testament, the New South is crystallized in a speech in 1886 in New York City by a man by the name of Henry Grady. Henry Grady was the editor and publisher of the Atlanta Journal newspaper, the premier, largest newspaper in what was a mostly rural South. It was the biggest town, Atlanta, and he was a segregationist and racist and a white leader, but he was also someone that said it's time to move on past slavery and let us Southern whites do our thing. And he had been part of a group of leaders who intentionally wanted to let the northern whites know that we're here, we're back, we've risen from the ashes, and we're not going back. We're not going to have you dominating us, and we're not going to have Black Americans in the South dominating us white Southerners. And so he gave a speech, which we could call kind of the resurrection speech. It's commonly referred to by historians as the New South speech in 1886. And I just want to share a poignant part of this speech. So he's speaking to the New England Society, this highbrow Harvard-esque body of men, white men in New York City. He says, I want to say to General Sherman, so Sherman's in the room, who is considered an able man in our parts, though some people think he is kind of a careless man about fire. So Grady starts a little kind of humor, a little joke, that from the ashes he left us in 1864, we have raised a brave and beautiful city, that somehow or other we have caught the sunshine in the bricks and mortar of our homes and have builded therein not one ignoble prejudice or memory, not one ignoble prejudice or memory. It is a rare privilege, sir, to have had part, however humble, in this work. Never was nobler duty confided to human hands than the uplifting and upbuilding of the prostrate and bleeding South. Misguided, perhaps, but beautiful in her suffering, and honest, brave, and generous always. He's talking about the South. In the record of her social, industrial, and political illustration, we await with confidence the verdict of the world. This is said in no spirit of time-serving or apology. The South has nothing for which to apologize. She believes that the late struggle between the states was war and not rebellion, revolution and not conspiracy, and that her convictions were as honest as yours. I should be unjust to the dauntless spirit of the South and to my own convictions if I did not make this plain in this presence. The South has nothing to take back. This is a declaration. It's not a declaration of independence. It's a declaration of resurrection. It is a statement that we are back and we will be firm in our beliefs and our systems and our approaches. We will not take advice from you in the American South. We will not take your pity. We will not take advice from you in the North. We in the South, we white Southerners in the South, will make our own decisions. This is the post-Reconstruction New South. The South has risen, has risen. We can see a concrete manifestation of this resurrection and this rise again through looking at what the Southern Poverty Law Center calls public spaces with Confederacy names. I showed in the last lecture yesterday a map of where these all appeared. They appear mostly in the American South because that's where they're first going to strengthen the narrative and foundationally build it and construct it and embed it. But it wasn't only there. There were periodic dots around the country. This is a timeline of when these were put in. So the map I showed last time is where they are. This is a timeline of when they were put in. And it goes from 1865 through just after World War II on this timeline. And the evidence here shows this very, very large push and increase around the turn of the century, 1900, 1910, 1920, really about a 20-year window there, when there was this fierce, fierce, fierce commitment to build and to inscribe this Southern ideology, this lost cause notion that the South has risen and the South's ideas and values actually are preeminent. And the Southern Poverty Law Center has denoted a couple pieces along the way. So that's where some of the lines and some of the years are noted. And I just want to start with highlighting the first six of them. First six of the first seven. Six of those first seven are about organizations that were formed to put forward a narrative, a certain perspective, to fight for certain values, this lost cause values. And they were formed from the Klan through early Confederate memorial organizations to eventually the founding of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And in 1900, these organizations begin to come together and to say, we have common cause. We can work together. We can make this happen. And so I just want to highlight by putting circles or ovals around them that these are all associations, societies, organizations that come together with that are formed to put forward a certain story, a certain message to the world. And so to me, that is very instructive of how the lost cause got promulgated. Once they're in place, they can begin to put these monuments and these markers and get these schools named after Confederate heroes all over the South and eventually the country. So we see the associations created, and then they're followed by this large increase. And then after this large increase, the battle has been mostly won. So there's no need to keep pushing at as high of a ratio. So the associations come first, and then the institutionalization of the lost cause ideology. One of the very first and most important things that these associations do is to create a narrative and place it in textbooks, school textbooks. And this is a very famous pamphlet and then eventual book written by Milford Rutherford, who is Mildred Rutherford, who is the president of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And in 1897, they convene a subcommittee that's going to focus on textbooks, and they begin to pull along these other associations. And that's why there's a meeting in 1900, 3 years later, to convince them of the importance of getting their history into the textbooks, taught the way they want. And they create what is called a measuring rod. It's a measuring rod for testing, for making sure that textbooks carry forward the history as they want it taught. And they come up with 8 measuring sticks in their assessment of every single textbook about American history that is going to go and be sold to public schools around the country. Those 8 measurements include that the textbook should not say that the South that the South seceded. They should say that instead that the South was engaged in a revolution, not a secession. They said that Southerners should be depicted as Southern whites as genteel, loving slave masters. That the war should not be presented as about slavery. It should be presented as about freedoms. Okay. The message should be presented that the war was primarily a northern aggression against the South. So they had these 8 measuring sticks that they had, and they called it a measuring rod. And this becomes the template, the checklist that is used by these Southern associations to influence textbooks and narratives and markers and monuments and the histories that schools tell about their own naming and the names and the histories that towns tell about their own selves. For decades, incredibly influential. Along the way, they begin to commence certain very iconic moments that really, really cement this journey of the lost cause into the American psyche. In 1888, on the 25th anniversary of the Gettysburg Battle of 1863, you have the reunion of almost entirely Northern Union men, except for the men in the middle who I pointed out last time, with James Longstreet, who was a Southern Confederate general and was the right-hand general of Robert E. Lee. This is Longstreet pictured in the middle of a whole bunch of Northern Union leaders. To his left, on our right, is a guy by the name of General Dan Sickles, who Longstreet had fought against, and Sickles lost a leg. And here they are finding kind of like a sense of respect for each other and common cause. They all cheer for Longstreet and say that he's one of us now. He's a Union man. He's a Republican. He believes in this cause. Two steps to the left in our visual, and it's to the right of Longstreet, is a man by the name of Joshua Chamberlain. And Joshua Chamberlain is a really famous, I think, a lieutenant, a captain, not even a general, and he holds Little Round Top, this incredible iconic fight on the second day, and Chamberlain is there, and it goes on to be governor of Maine for 2 terms. And so to have Longstreet there from the South with these Northern men was this incredible moment of like the North beginning to accept that even if you fought on that side, we can welcome you in if you're willing to, essentially buy into this kind of broader American initiative. And so they bring in Longstreet. In 1890, 2 years later, a monument goes up in Richmond on what becomes known as Monument Avenue, the most famous stretch of Confederate statues in the country. They've all come down now after George Floyd. But for over 100 years, they were on Monument Avenue, and the most famous is the Robert E. Lee Monument. And it was so high and tall and enormous. And it was a statement about this man, Robert E. Lee, a Virginian, and he anchored the South, and how he was this noble savior of the South. And this statue on Monument Avenue, with other statues of Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart and Jefferson Davis all along Monument Avenue, are part of the Richmond, the former capital of the Confederacy, saying to the American North, we lost, but we stand high and strong and proud, and we have nothing to apologize for. In 1898, a monument that is the parallel to this opens or is finished in Montgomery, Alabama, on the grounds of the state capitol, and it's still there. It has not been taken down in Alabama. In fact, it's against the law in Alabama as of 2017 to take down any monument or marker or statue on public land that is more than 40 years old, just to protect all of these. They made it so. This is a massive Confederate monument with the cornerstone laid by Jefferson Davis himself in 1884. This statue celebrates the great Alabama lost cause traditions. These two, from Richmond, the second capital of the Confederacy, to Montgomery, the first capital of the Confederacy, are seen as the bookends to this claim, this public declaration by the South of that we will build our statues high, we will stand proud, we will revel in our, as we see it, nobility. We have nothing to apologize for. We have risen. In 1914, this work goes so far as to put that statue that I mentioned in Arlington Cemetery. I began this, come on back. I began this lecture yesterday with the Arlington Cemetery monument that I showed you. And in 1914, the Daughters of the Confederacy get this put in a certain section of Arlington to honor, to recognize the Confederate dead. That stays there until 2023. And then in 1913, on what is the 50th anniversary of the Gettysburg Battle, the living leaders of the North and the South come together, and the whole reunion is not just a Longstreet now. Now it's the Northerners and the Southern whites. They're all white, saying, let us put this behind us and let us find common cause and go forward together. and let you, the Northern whites, saying, you Southern whites, you will control the South. Let us just have peace. And they have this famous photograph where they're shaking hands across the Confederate and the Union divide in a very iconic location on the Gettysburg battlefield, what's called the Angle, where the most fiercest fighting and where the Confederates eventually broke the Union lines very briefly on the third day is at. This reunion of North and South, this is merged with the declaration by the American South that we have risen and we will build our statues and our monuments and markers high, and we will not apologize, is the Southern resurrection. And the lost cause is strengthened by this. The lost cause could be an idea and never have taken off. But when you have the lost cause and you have all of that investment by associations, by organizations, who would then create all these historical public markers, they get the textbooks to address the world the way they want to address it. And they build these grand statues, these statements, these declarations. That's how the lost cause wins nationally, the ideal battle, and also lasts for generation upon generation. Along the way, there are these, they're not periodic. I was going to use the word periodic, but they're not. They're regular and systemic racial massacres by whites of African Americans. They occur over time in several states. Along with the lost cause ideology and narrative, there is the white redemption, the white reclaiming of power in the American South that takes forms of the most violent violence. We have a marching on the Republican legislature in Colfax, Louisiana in 1873 that surrounds the state capitol in Louisiana and kills all of these Black legislators. It's an insurrection in its most violent form. In 1890, the Mississippi Constitution turns that worldview into a new state constitution that disenfranchises Black Americans. It imposes literacy tests and poll taxes and what's called understanding clauses and grandfather clauses to wipe out the voting of Black men. But prior to this, Black men in the 1880s in Mississippi there had been about 87% of them had been registered to vote. It's just stunning. It's a stunning number. But after redemption, white redemption, and eventually the Mississippi Constitution, it drops down to about 5% of Black men can vote. And so the Constitution enshrines white supremacy and enshrines, institutionalizes the lost cause ideas that the monuments and the textbooks are speaking to, and that the violence is also driving. In 1898, there's a massacre in Wilmington, North Carolina, where a interracial body of lower income whites and African Americans have come together to build a government, and the white leaders in town and in the area won't have it. And they go in and they kill all these people in North Carolina. In 1906, there's the Atlanta race riots where prosperous African Americans on Auburn Avenue, where we spend some of the time on our learning tours, are targeted by white elites who don't want W.E.B. Du Bois and others to have this kind of growing presence. It was a very prosperous part of Black life in Atlanta, and they targeted them and used them as foils for a governor's campaign where two segregationists were trying to outdo each other. And they murder, kill, massacre all these African Americans in Atlanta in 1906. In 1915, The Birth of a Nation film is released, and this is a film that is pure propaganda for the Ku Klux Klan. It's a depiction of the American South after the Civil War as a lawless place where incompetent lazy, drunken, sexually abandoned African-American men were on the loose, and the white women were saved by the great redeemers, the Ku Klux Klan. And this film by D.W. Griffith is a massive national hit. It's the biggest film up to this date in U.S. history. It's watched by millions. It's silent. It's got text on the screen, but it's silent. And it's so widely embraced that Woodrow Wilson watches it in the White House and says it's tragic but true. And he said you've caught lightning in a bottle here by telling these truths. And it is the rise of the Klan in its greatest kind of moments in American history. And it further provides fodder for the belief, the argument that the cause that was lost in the South was the right cause. The cause of enslavement, of white supremacy, of white dominance was the right cause. It further undergirds that. I would make the case that this film both further cemented that and was not possible, the success it had, without all of these other lost cause, both rhetorical moves, symbolic communications move, the textbooks and the statues and markers in the schools, as well as the very real physical violence. In 1917, there's a massacre in East St. Louis of African Americans by whites, some from Illinois, some from Missouri, and they come together to wipe out this section of the town where they're seen as again, a threat to the white establishment. In 1919, we have Red Summer, which is the killing of many returning Black veterans from World War II across many cities and towns, including Chicago in the United States. Red Summer, so much blood flowed of African Americans that it was called Red Summer, the racial targeting of African Americans. In 1921, we have the Tulsa Massacre, which has gotten more attention in the last few years as we commemorated the 100-year anniversary of it, where, like in Atlanta, a very prosperous body of town where African Americans thrived, was targeted and destroyed by whites who were threatened and did not want this to be present. Somehow it was hurting the economy and the systems and the culture of white Americans. And in 1923, we have the Rosewood, Florida massacre, where again, it's the story of a prosperous, thriving part of Florida that is Black in its people, in its customs, in its heritages, is attacked and massacred by white Floridians. In 1926, the Ku Klux Klan is so strong and so emboldened by doing all of these things, driving all these things, contributing to all these things. In 1915, after Birth of a Nation comes out, the Ku Klux Klan, which had been squashed really in the 1870s by federal troops, is rebirthed again, and it's rebirthed in Georgia at Stone Mountain, which has a famous engraving of Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee on it, a massive granite engraving of that. And the Klan is rebirthed there by burning a cross on top of the Stone Mountain. And the Klan is so big, it reaches its largest numbers in terms of membership in the 1920s in the United States. And they have a march in Washington, D.C. down Pennsylvania Avenue, celebrating their resurrection, the Southern resurrection. And to march down Pennsylvania Avenue is to make the declaration that we own this town. Washington is a Southern town, and this has become a Southern nation. This Southern resurrection, if we were rooting for these people, if we were wanting this to happen, we would be, like they have, shouting from the rooftops and claiming it as such a great return, as Grady did in 1886, from the ashes of a beaten people, a crushed society, We, of course, are not trumpeting this. This is not the values that I hold, or you all who are joining these lectures hold. We know that. So we're mortified by it. But for those folks who are craving that identity, that are living that identity, that are believing to the core that this is the right view of the world, this is a grand, grand story. It is the equivalent to Jesus coming out of the tomb in 3 days. It is every bit as deeply felt in the Southern psyche and eventually in the national psyche as that notion of Christianity. Okay. That's what gets us to what scholars have called the Southern nation. All right. And that Southern nation thrived upon this narrative that obscured the reality, but allowed the reality to continue to live. So the narrative allowed the narrative allowed the reality to thrive while obscuring it at the same time. And the reality from the Confederacy was that what was worthy was slavery, that the villains were Northerners and especially Abraham Lincoln, that the victims were Southern and Christian white. The response was to restore power, the reclamation of white power, and the methods were whatever it took, violence and disfranchisement of Black men. That's the reality. The narrative, we know that we walked through yesterday. The narrative starts not with slavery, but the narrative starts with the sovereignty of states and citizens to make their own decisions about property and justice. The property they're interested in and the sovereignty they're concerned about is primarily about enslavement of Africans and African Americans. But to call it sovereignty of states' rights is to give it the more noble kind of phraseology and the safer terminology. The villains in this are not Northerners per se, they're the federal government, and eventually it's going to be just all government because they're seen as imposing upon these states and these sovereign states and citizens, imposing these tyrannical viewpoints, such as the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment, that people should have the right to vote, and then the 14th Amendment, that everybody should be equal before the laws. These are tyrannical ideas being pushed upon the sovereign states and citizens in this narrative. Who's the victims? It's the heritage and the tradition and the ways of life of these people, these white Southerners. They were just quality people who have had their traditions and their heritage ruined and thrown out and their lives disrespected. What's the response? It's to fight and fight with everything we're worth for individual freedoms, particularly the freedom that allow white people to reassert their power, the freedoms to attend the schools you want to attend, the freedoms to not hire who you don't want to hire, the freedom to pay people differential wages, the individual freedoms that sovereign states and citizens have, as long as the tyrannical federal government doesn't wipe out the heritage and the traditions and the ways of life of those people. And ultimately, what are the methods? The methods are always resistance to the government, starting with the federal government first and foremost, but really to any government that is seen as stamping on the sovereignty of Southern whites. The narrative aligns 100% with the reality, and it allows the reality to slide along and to glide along without having to defend itself. The narrative exists so that the reality can exist. The narrative supports, it wraps, and it promotes the endurance of the reality. And in the narrative, the two most important pieces of the narrative are these two, that the sovereignty of the states, what will be called states' rights, are being threatened and trampled upon by a tyrannical federal government, and eventually a tyrannical government even in states if they dare to uphold federal Supreme Court decisions or federal laws. This is the fundamental foundational piece in the narrative, the idea that states are sovereign. This is one of the rules in the measuring rod of the textbooks. It had that the textbooks must refer to the sovereignty of states, and that the United States is a collection of states in a compact, not a federal entity in which the states are subservient to the federal government. The sovereignty of the states is the ultimate. And with this in place, the narrative then has its villain, anybody from the federal government who's trying to tell the states what to do. That narrative enables you to very quickly slide under it, that what has been lost are the heritage, traditions, and ways in life, that what must be regained are individual white freedoms, and that the way to do that is forever resistance to the federal government. Those last three things are just logical follows once you understand and buy into the belief that what is preeminent here is the sovereignty of these states and these citizens, and that the federal government is bad, 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 bad. You, of course, have to be forever resistance to the federal government. And yes, we need to fight for those individual freedoms, because that's how we live our sovereign identities. So those last three items all logically follow when you have first installed this conflict of sovereign states that are preeminent to a tyrannical federal government. But those foundational pieces, the sovereignty of the states and citizens and the tyrannical federal government, also enables us to keep these things in place, even though they are not being said out loud. They will not be talked about. They will not be said, but they will exist. The reality will exist. They will continue to exist exactly as they are. Southern Christian whites will continue to have their white power sustained and restored, and they'll use violence and disfranchising to do it. But that will not be the public narrative. The public narrative will be these dimensions over here. Sovereign states fighting against a tyrannical federal government, merely protecting their heritage, tradition, ways of life, and then in the pursuit of individual freedoms that everybody should have, starting with those who can claim power, which just happens coincidentally to be white people. The narrative works beautifully to enable the reality to live and to exist without ever having to be talked about. And in fact, Southern whites didn't want to talk about the realities. They did not want it to be named. They did not want it to be a centerpiece of the public discourse, the political environment, because it was embarrassing. It was humiliating. It ripped apart the lies that they told. I want to just go on here in a second, but it just, as a communications scholar, the ability of the narrative here to do the work that allows the reality to exist is really a remarkable thing. It does not, by definition, automatically happen. The narrative has to be incredibly resonant. And I talked about why it is, because of its connection to Christianity. It has to be incredibly resonant. It has to be promulgated, put forward by organizations that are completely and wholly committed to it. There can be no holding back or questioning. There has to be an entire embrace of this. And it has to be a relentless, complete, absolute war, essentially. And if you have that resonant narrative and you have that wholehearted commitment by a body of people that will take no prisoners in the pursuit of this, that will take no quarter, that will give in no inches at all, then they got a great chance to win. They do. They get a great chance to win, and they do. They win because Northern whites eventually acquiesce, and Southern and Northern Black people and in the western part of this nation, Asian Americans do not have the resources and the power and the allies to be able to effectively counter it until decades later. The narrative is necessary. It cannot do it, though, without those intentional associations and organizations and their strategic endeavors to make it so embedded. This book, Southern Nation, by Bateman et al., is a book that in political science circles has been really influential. It takes all of these ways of looking at Congress from Civil War through really World War II, and looking at the way that the Southern states came to dominate policy in the United States, that they shaped the way the New Deal was enacted. They shaped the way that civil rights legislation was not implemented. They shaped the way in which economic policies that affected ranchers in the West were enacted, because those ranchers in those members of Congress from the West needed to find votes in the East, and the Southern whites said, we'll find common ground with you if you'll vote with us on the things that we want. And Southern Nation is this really deep dive into the ways in which the lost cause and Southern dominance, Southern white dominance, Southern white Christian dominance, Southern white Christian male dominance came to define our political institutions. Okay, so let's go back to this here. This is the slide I already showed you of the creation of all of these markers and these schools and these, what the Southern Poverty Law Center calls public spaces that recognize and trumpet Confederate heroes. And it takes us through World War II. And roughly by the end of World War I, the push has been done, the win has been accrued, but there are these periodic kind of like just further hammering and cementing, but it's not, but the battle has been won. These are just kind of like remnants of holding strong these entities. But then it begins to trickle down as you get into World War II. And it gets harder to justify this worldview when African-American men are fighting in wars and are contributing to our society and are willing to be the Tuskegee Airmen, for example. The reality is that we see it as a little bit diminishing as we get into World War II. And that's where the Southern Poverty Law Center graphic ends. Okay, there is more to it in their graphic. I'm not including it here because I'm going to talk about the rise back up in the 1950s and 1960s of this push again. But it takes us to a very important moment there in late World War II in the late 1940s. And what happens in 1948 is that through pressure from returning Black veterans from the World War II, Harry Truman issues a commission that studies desegregation of the armed forces, and then he issues an executive order in 1948 to end segregation in the military. And this produces a crisis within the Democratic Party. Southern Democrats want nothing to do with this. Northern Democrats are supportive of this, and they've been driving it, but they're worried about their national power and what's going to happen. So this is a cataclysmic moment. And then 6 years later, the Supreme Court of the United States ends segregation in education in what is the end of a decades-long set of court cases by the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. Lawyers coming out of Howard University, taught by the great Charles Hamilton Houston, and then led by an army of students that rise up to become great leaders, Thurgood Marshall and Pauli Murray and Spotswood Robinson among them. And they eventually win the end of desegregation, the overturning of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which is a marker on the Southern Poverty Law Center there. It's the sixth one there in 1896, the overturning of that with a 9-0 court decision to end segregation in education. These two moments are tectonic explosions in the American racial cauldron. They are tectonic. They challenge to the core the fabric of decades of the rise of a Southern nation, the rise of a white supremacy rooted in the tradition of the American South, in the belief that, you know what, those Southern whites really had it right. They had it right. Slavery, we shouldn't have slavery, but white dominance, yes, we should have that. Christian dominance, Southern white Christian male dominance, yes, we should have all of that. These two decisions, these two actions explode that ideology. And it is these moments in world history where things occur and they seem unimaginable, really. Like, how did they do that? How did they get there? And they get there through an awful lot of people working very, very hard and devoting their lives, and people losing their lives, and the struggle and in the struggle. And those moments then happen. They're rare, do occur though. And when they do occur, tectonic change is possible. And people who don't want that change also rise up and they begin to fight against it. They begin to fight against that change. And so in this moment of these two decisions, these two actions, and then the Little Rock Nine in 1957 in Arkansas, when Dwight Eisenhower has to federalize the National Guard and send in the 82nd Airborne from, ironically, Fort Liberty in North Carolina. Are these moments of grand explosion. So I'm going to stop right here for 2 minutes because I'm going to go in and make a quick salad and I'll be right back. Because where we're going to go from here now is back to Montgomery, back to where Jefferson Davis took the oath of office, because the next Jefferson Davis, George Wallace, is coming onto the scene. I'll be back in a minute. Gotcha. All right, folks, I'm back. Hope you got a moment to grab a glass of wine or something. And I understand this is not the usual approach of one of these lectures, but that is, I hope you're okay with that because um, sometimes I juggle the different priorities and I want to make sure I'm still there as much as I can be as a parent. So we have these tectonic things that happen. The desegregation of the armed forces, which begins to mean desegregation on military bases across the American South. So there becomes these islands of desegregation on federal facilities across the South, and these become flashpoints. And then the desegregation of schools, or at least the court decision of it, which leads many Southern jurisdictions to close their schools rather than educate Black children alongside white children. The 1948 decision by Truman to desegregate the armed forces leads the Southern Democratic leadership across the white Southern Democratic leadership across these states to leave, to essentially secede from the Democratic Party and to go form their own party. And they call themselves the Dixiecrats. And they meet in Birmingham, Alabama in 1948, and they nominate Strom Thurmond as their presidential candidate, and they begin to basically be sometimes with the Democratic Party and sometimes a separate third party from the Northern Democrats and the Republicans. In 1954, with the Brown v. Board of Education decision, many of these folks pull away even further from the National Democratic leadership and become the Southern bloc, the segregationist Southern bloc. So we go back to Montgomery, Alabama, and this is the state capital, and it's as white as you can find marble to be white. And it's a rebuilt from the original capital. This was rebuilt in 1850. And as you look up this is from the street right out in front. It's actually from right where Martin Luther King Jr. delivers a famous speech at the end of the Selma and the march from Selma to Montgomery. As you look up the state capitol, you see an imposing figure on the left there. And that is Jefferson Davis, because it is at this capitol in 1861 that Jefferson Davis delivered his inaugural address for the Confederacy, and then came down the steps and marched down this street that is like that we're looking up right now. It's Dexter Avenue, marched down Dexter Avenue. And this is the door where Davis stood right in front of and took the oath of office in 1861. And that's the door right there, same door. And right inscribed in the marble steps there is a star put into place by the Sophie Bibb chapter of the Daughters of the Confederacy to note the spot where Jefferson Davis stood when inaugurated President of the United States, February 18th, 1861. This was put into place, the star, to honor that by the Daughters of the Confederacy. This is the kind of determination and level of commitment that it takes. All right. They put it there. And then there's Davis over here, imposingly guarding the state capitol, looking down Dexter Avenue, looking directly essentially at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where Dr. King is a minister in the 1950s, and where the Montgomery bus boycott has some of its life built out of there. Davis, by the way, is not an Alabamian. most state capitals, when you have a figure of somebody, a statue of somebody, it's somebody from the state. They're honoring one of their own. Davis is not Alabamian, he's a Mississippian. So why would you have him up there? Well, if you see him as a national leader, as like basically the equivalent of a George Washington, then it's okay to put such a figure on a state capitol grounds. And that's what Davis functions as. He's the national leader for Alabama, for white Alabama. So that's how revered today Jefferson Davis et al. Is on the state capitol grounds in white Alabama. Well, in 1963, George Wallace, in his inaugural address for the governorship, pays homage to Jefferson Davis. All right. He pays homage and essentially exalts Davis and positions him, Wallace, as the one to whom the baton is being passed from Jefferson Davis. So when Wallace was a young man, at the age of, I think, 9, he went to the state capitol with father, and they roamed the grounds. And that memorial that I showed you from Montgomery is right there on the state capitol grounds. And this star was in place from the Sophie Bibb chapter. And Wallace publicly talks about him at that young age standing on that star and vowing to himself that he was going to someday he will become the next great leader of Alabama. In his mind, the governor of Alabama, and ultimately maybe even more than that, but that he is inspired and reveres and will carry forward the traditions, the heritages, the ways of life, the narrative. When he's 16 years old, he goes around the state senate and knocks on the doors of all the senators looking to become a page for them, a summer intern. And he's hired, and he spends his time there. And he's just so mesmerized by this power, this sense of greatness. And he's further redoubles his plans and his desires. Wallace goes to the University of Alabama, graduates in the early 1940s, serves in the U.S. military, comes back and becomes a state state legislator, and then runs to be a judge, wins that judgeship, and is a judge for about a decade in the 1950s in the state of Alabama. And he's known as a pretty moderate judge, racially moderate. He's clearly a white racist segregationist, but he treats African-American defendants and the very few Black lawyers that he interacts with, he treats them reasonably. He's known among Black citizens and lawyers as somebody who recognizes the humanity of these individuals. As one example of this, he orders sandwiches in for a conference meeting, a conversation between a white lawyer and a Black lawyer that is going to occur. They cannot eat anywhere in public in Montgomery, and they cannot go to anybody's home to do this. So he orders the sandwiches in to his chambers and allows them to have this conference meeting in his chambers because it can't occur anywhere else. He often would refer to lawyers, Black lawyers, with the term of address of Mr., which was very, 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 very uncommon among whites in this time. So Wallace is known as a fairly moderate individual. And in 1958, he runs for the governorship, and he runs against a guy by the name of John Patterson. And Patterson is more openly racist, more openly segregationist than Wallace is. And Wallace actually highlights this, that he is not Patterson, that he is more racially moderate than Patterson, and that the good white folks of Alabama should want this perspective that he has, that it's better for the society. He loses to Patterson. The last night of the election, he goes on television to give a kind of like a speech in which he says, look, if you don't think that the way forward that I'm offering is what is the right way, then I accept that. But I will stay true to my values. I will not throw down the racial gauntlet the same way. He loses in 1958. And he takes from that a very clear political lesson that if he wants to gain the power that he wants, he's going to have to become more racist, more openly segregationist, more openly hostile to the federal government, that he's going to have to buy this narrative. He's going to have to pick up the narrative that is there for him by this point in time and use it as a weapon, as a tool. And so he becomes hostile in his public speeches towards the federal government. He begins to defend the sovereignty of Alabama, and he adopts a much more openly, overtly racist posture. And he wins the next governor election in 1962, and he wins it by a landslide. In 1963, at his inaugural, he stands on that star of Jefferson Davis in front of the door and takes the oath of office. And that top photo on the left is a picture of him taking that oath of office with the phraseology of "In God We Trust" right there. He's taken the oath of office standing on this Jefferson Davis star. And then he comes down the Capitol steps, not quite to the base, but to one of the kind of lower tiers, and gives the inaugural address. And it's a freezing, the weather is freezing this day. It's literally like one of the coldest days in Alabama record. And he gives this address, and it is probably the most famous governor speech in American history. In 1963, his inaugural. Elected in 1962, takes office, I believe, on January 18th of 1963. On this very, very cold day, and he stands on the Star of Davis and honors Davis, and then comes down the stairs and gives this inaugural speech. And it is in this inaugural speech that he famously says, I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And we're going to see him say that in a moment from a video clip. And it is this declaration, this statement, and the way he wraps himself in this narrative that is what's most important. Okay. So here's Davis. I'm sorry. Here's Wallace. And these are archival copies of his speech that day, and the edits that we see on here are his own edits. And so these are roughly the chronology of the speech. These are some of his opening words right here. He right off the bat invokes the savior, Robert E. Lee. He says, General Robert E. Lee said that duty is the most sublime word in the English language. And I have come, this is Wallace, increasingly to realize what he meant. I shall do my duty to you, God helping, to every man, to every woman, yes, and to every child in the state. I shall fulfill my duty toward honesty and economy in our state government so that no man shall have a part of his livelihood cheated, and no child shall have a bit of his future stolen away. Remember way back at the beginning of yesterday's lecture, I talked about the power of the lost cause ideology, that the cause, when lost, is particularly elevated if the argument is, if the belief is there that the cause was stolen. And so right off the bat in his inaugural speech, he's invoking the idea of something having been stolen and having been cheated, and that he will not stand for this. And then he says, today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate then that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generations of forebears before us done, time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us, and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. It's the narrative. It's the freedom-loving, individual freedom-loving folks fighting against the tyranny of the federal government. We will fight forever, today, tomorrow, forever, against that tyranny. This is what it sounded like live. Let's see. Okay. This is a video of that address, and it's been colorized, so that we get the full kind of power of it all.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us, and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Right behind Wallace, over his right shoulder, as we're looking at him on the left, the man in the hat, is a guy by the name of Asa Carter. And Asa Carter was a very active, prominent member of the local Klan. And he is the person that Wallace hired after losing in 1958 to become his speechwriter and to help him to infuse an updated narrative. He's not arguing for slavery, an updated narrative about individual freedoms and state sovereignty. And so that's Carter there, essentially watching his protege to live out the teachings that go all the way back to Davis. In that little paragraph that we just read, there's set 3 references to segregation. They're all right at the end, obviously. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. There's one more in the entire address. That's it. There's 3 right there, and then there's one more. That's because the narrative doesn't want him to dwell on that action. The narrative instead requires that he dwell on the fight for individual freedoms, and that being white freedoms to dominate, to have dominance, to achieve whatever the white leaders want. So when you look at that speech, he actually invokes freedom 25 times in the course of the speech. Freedom, freedom, freedom-loving blood, the freedom of our forebears. It's a speech about freedom, individual freedoms, as the essential response, the way in which Southern white supremacy can live out. It's not about segregation, most of it. It's about individual freedoms, which produce segregation, but are not to be the pieces that are going to be trumpeted over and over and over again. And this is where the importance of freedom as a concept becomes essential to understanding the through line from Davis to Wallace to Trump. It's about certain kinds of freedom and who gets to decide those freedoms. Who gets to decide those freedoms? At the end of the last lecture yesterday, there was a great question about how is it that the Southern lost cause ideology and its focus on individual freedoms is able to square that worldview with the subjugation of women. Of course, particularly African-American women, but white women today too. And it's the way it's done is about whose freedoms are we talking about here? And this is what the focus is of the book by Professor Jefferson Cowie of Vanderbilt University in 2023, his book, Freedom's Dominion. It's about the white definitions of freedom that the Southern lost cause resistance constructed and the way in which it gained adherence in the North that further underscored and allowed the construction of ghettos and pockets of communities where people of color were forced to live. So I want to quote a little bit from Jefferson Cowie's book. George Wallace, famous as a defender of segregation, cast himself to be a fighter for freedom. From the American Revolution to the ongoing civil rights struggle, Americans have come to associate the concept of freedom with the fight of the oppressed for a better life and a better world. Few ideas are central to the American mythos. It is easy to ignore or dismiss Wallace's call for freedom as little more than ideological window dressing for his racism. The real story, however, is far deeper and more complex. What the world heard that cold January day was a politician with a preternatural capacity to channel the currents of Southern and national history into the nation's most cherished ideal. We intend, he declared, quite simply to practice the free heritage as bequeathed to us as sons of free fathers. He tapped into what one historian has called an obsessive, quote, fear of an imminent loss of freedom, unquote, displayed throughout Southern and American history. Because federal authority often proved to be an essential, if often fallible, means of redress for non-white people, generations of white leaders like Wallace saw federal authority as a threat to their social order. A sophisticated Southern leader who understood how to leverage the lost cause, Wallace built a career repeating an enduring and widespread American promise to keep federal power at bay. His brand of freedom was ideological, specifically with strategic, political, and racial intent, a means to maintain local white political and economic power. Freedom from what whites deplored as federal tyranny, therefore, was the ironic ticket that provided license to practice actual tyranny in countless places like Alabama. From the theft of native lands to the suppression of modern civil rights movements, conflict between federal power and local autonomy forged a peculiar ideology of white freedom, an ever-evolving freedom to dominate others. And that's white freedom and the argument that Cowie puts forward of this powerful notion of white freedom. It is certainly white masculinized freedom, white Christian masculinized freedom, for sure. And it has not disappeared. It is vibrant and robust in America right now in our lifetimes. Here's a little bit more of what Wallace goes on to say. Hear me, Southerners. Hear me, you sons and daughters who have moved north and west throughout this nation. We call on you from your native soil to join with us in national support and vote. And we know wherever you are, away from the hearts of the Southland, that you will respond. For though you may live in the farthest regions of this vast country, your heart has never left Dixieland. Your heart's never left the South. This is why the title to this slide is South to America. Wallace, in this speech, understood that he was promoting this position not to the Southern whites, but to the whites of America across the country. And you, native sons and daughters of old New England's rock-ribbed patriotism, and you, sturdy natives of the great Midwest, and you, descendants of the far west flaming spirit of pioneer freedom, we invite you to come and be with us, for you are of the Southern mind and the Southern spirit and the Southern philosophy. You are Southerners too, and brothers with us in our fight. Wallace, from the beginning, understood that this is a message that could and would have national appeal. And so he's giving a 1963 inaugural address, standing on the oath of office on the star where Jefferson Davis took his oath of office, and then delivering his segregation now, tomorrow, and forever speech from the base of the Capitol, knowing that what he is saying has national resonance, that if delivered right and delivered in a certain narrative, robust way that obscures the racism and puts forward the state sovereignty, that it could have national appeal. Wallace understood this. He was the most adept and ambitious politician to come along to seek to do this. And he had the response against the 1948 desegregation of the armed forces and the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education. He had the response, what was often called the backlash, or ultimately called massive resistance of Southern whites. He had that wave, that tidal wave that he could surf, that he could ride. It's what Trump will ride after Obama. So you had this confluence of historical moment, ideological energy, cultural movement, and a political figure who comes in and says, give me the narrative. I will tweak it in a way that obscures the racism and positions this as an issue of federal tyranny versus state sovereignty. And I will call to all those Southerners across the country. If I agreed with Wallace and loved what he had to say, I too would just stand in awe of what he sought to do and the way in which he did it. It is a brilliant manipulation of the worst dimensions of human life. That's what it is. It's strategically brilliant. And Wallace knew what he was doing, and so does Trump. Okay, going into the last bit of this lecture. Wallace goes national. He immediately runs for the presidency in 1964. And he runs as a Democrat because he's a Southern Democrat, and he doesn't see any utility at this point to joining the Republican Party. It wouldn't help him in his future in Alabama at all. And it wasn't going to help him, as he saw, in his national endeavor. So he runs in the Democratic presidential contest. He knows he's not going to beat Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson is clearly going to win the nomination. What George Wallace wants to do is to test out his message. He wants to try. He wants to see just how far can I adapt this message to appeal to the country. And when he looks at the map, he decides he wants to run in 3 Democratic primaries: in Wisconsin, in Indiana, and in Maryland, in that order chronologically. And he decides to enter those primaries for the Democratic nomination against Lyndon Johnson. And the governor of Wisconsin, a Republican, says, we don't want you, George Wallace. Don't come here. Don't come here and campaign. We don't want you. And you'll never get any votes. He says, you won't even get 100,000 votes if you come here. Wallace says, okay, all right, fine. I hear you. I'm coming. And he comes and campaigns in Wisconsin, and he campaigns in rural Wisconsin, and he campaigns in the white working class enclaves of Milwaukee and Racine. He goes into the white immigrant communities. When he goes into a bar in Milwaukee, a Polish ethnic enclave, they sing him Dixie in Polish to welcome him. He says, I will never live outside of Alabama, but if I were to live outside of Alabama, I feel so at home here in southern Milwaukee that I would move here. George Wallace doesn't get 100,000 votes in the primary. He gets 260,000 votes in the primary. He loses to Johnson. He get what that totals as a third of the Democratic Party votes. So he gets a third. But it's a very clear statement that my message can be adapted of the states' rights, sovereignty, individual freedoms, heritage, tradition, and ways of life against the federal tyranny can be adopted and can play out. And it can obscure the racism while everybody can nonetheless know it's there. He then goes to Indiana and he competes in Indiana. And Indiana is known as, commonly known as the most southern of the northern states. And southern Indiana is just about as southern as you can find. And in Indiana, Wallace wins another third of the Democratic primary vote, loses to Johnson, but gets a third. And then he enters in Maryland. And in Maryland, which had been a slaveholding state during the Civil War, even though it fought on behalf of the Union, Wallace gets 42.5% of the Democratic vote. Doesn't win, but gets over 40%. Wallace has done what he wanted to do to test out his message, and he's seen great resonance for it. And he's made his point, and he's also understood his own kind of trajectory forward. So he goes back to Alabama, serves his term. You cannot get reelected at this time as governor. Today you can, but at that time you could not be reelected for consecutive terms. So he doesn't run in 1966. Instead, he runs his wife, Lurleen, who's got cancer and would die a year into office. But she runs as the governor in a really what is a reelect George kind of mindset and model. And she wins election. And when she passes away, there's somebody else who serves, but it's really George Wallace who's the governor essentially. And he bides his time and begins to further calibrate his message to 1968. He changes the slogan of "Stand Up for Alabama," to "Stand Up for America." It's really easy. Make America great again. Make America great again. In 1968, he runs as an independent. He doesn't run on the Democratic ticket this time, and he's a third-party candidate. And in that election, he, as the independent candidate, wins 5 states in the American South: Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. And he's the reason why Hubert Humphrey loses narrowly to Richard Nixon in that election. Wallace wins these 5 deep southern states. And late in the campaign, he has a rally in New York City where he has a sold out Madison Square Garden rally. And this is him at that rally getting that national, northern in this case, national, this most iconic of places, Madison Square Garden reception. Wallace has become a major figure on the national scene, and people are paying attention to his techniques, his ability to be racist without sounding racist, his ability to pick up the lost cause arguments while updating them to notions of states' rights. And so I'm going to finish this lecture with this set of slides here, talking about the presidency. So Wallace runs for the Democratic nomination in 64, runs for the president in 68. He runs again in 72 and 76. He's doing quite well in 72 in the Democratic. He's running again as a Democrat. He's doing quite well. He's challenging McGovern pretty strongly, but then he's shot in Maryland. He's shot. He doesn't die, but it completely destroys his campaign. He can't campaign after that. And he's never going to be that national figure again that he had become at that time. But his footprint is established, and others have taken heed and have noticed and have understood what he did, and that this backlash to the civil rights movement has enormous political capital that can be channeled, can be harnessed, can be used by others who will come along and be strategic in how they're going to do that. All right. And so tracking from Lyndon Johnson and the presidency through the early 2000s gives us a sense of how powerful this law cause, now updated into the notion of state sovereignty, federal tyranny, individual freedoms, and heritage, traditions, and ways of life, all in the interest of unspoken white supremacy, captures the nation. So Lyndon Johnson in 1963 becomes the first Southern president since 1868. We had not had a Southern president since Andrew Johnson in 1868. Lyndon, LBJ, proceeds then to pass the 1964 and the 1965, eventually the 1966 and 1968 Civil Rights Acts. And so he is seen as really a traitor to white Southerners. And with Wallace rising up and running as an independent, he's seen as the true kind of Southern white politician, having an integrity to this rise against the civil rights movement. Johnson is seen as the traitor to this. So Richard Nixon says, how can I do what Wallace is doing, but be more popular and national? And so he takes that narrative and he applies it to immigrants, to highly educated, lazy, northern, urban dwelling people. He talks about law and order. All of these are these subtle invocations of race. And he says, what we need is more law and order. We need to restore the individual freedoms of people who are the great Americans. And he invokes these traditions that resonate in the American South. And he can't out Wallace. He doesn't make the mistake that Wallace takes away from the 1958 governor's race. He says, I'm going to take Wallace's techniques, though, and make them more palatable to the American public. So I'm going to talk about law and order and work ethic and making sure that minorities are not overrunning our society, that the American way of life is protected. And he runs on what becomes known as the Southern strategy. Republicans begin to understand that they can peel off so many of those Southern whites that had been Democrats, but were now turning against the Democratic Party because of the civil rights movement. Nixon wins re-election in 1972 with 49 states, one of the greatest election sweeps in American history, running on these Southern kind of notions of supremacy, of dominance, of law and order, of power, of traditional agrarian heritages, ways of life, what he calls the silent majority, using a phrase coined by one of his speechwriters, Pat Buchanan. The silent majority, which is code for these great, upstanding white Americans. And he wins 49 seats. All right. Wallace's footprint has been stepped into and is being utilized by Nixon. 1976, Jimmy Carter wins the presidency as a Southern governor, and he wins back the South to do it. This is the electoral map after Watergate. Carter has an opening, and this is the electoral map. And see all that blue in the American South and all that red along the West Coast and in Maine and Michigan and Illinois. Those were different Republican Party times, different Southern white thinking. So Carter, a Southerner, wins back the South. In 1977, Carter reinstates the citizenship of Jefferson Davis. In 1980, Ronald Reagan wins the president following the same Southern strategy that Nixon had used, that had been an adaptation of Wallace. In his in the middle, at the beginning of his national public campaign in August, after the convention, the Republican convention, he kicks off his campaign by going to Neshoba County, Mississippi, which is where the three civil rights workers, Mickey Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Chaney, had been murdered. He goes there and gives a speech about states' rights. Doesn't talk about opposition to civil rights, doesn't talk about slavery, doesn't invoke racism, talks about states' rights and the sovereignty of states to make their own individual freedom decisions to protect their heritage, their traditions, and their ways of life. He wins that campaign over a Southern president. He adapts it and runs it further in 1984 and wins 49 states, just like Richard Nixon. These folks won 49 states on these updated Southern lost cause, now implemented in the notions of coded white racism. In 1988, George H.W. Bush wins election, the only vice president to win election after 2 terms of the previous president, the only vice president to ascend into the presidency in what is now 125 years. And he wins it by the strength of an incredibly poignant, impactful, and racist political advertisement known as the Willie Horton ad, in which they use a black man, Willie Horton, to stoke racial fears among whites about the crime policies of Michael Dukakis. And Dukakis does not respond. He allows it to happen. And that racism, again, this is not about racism, it's about crime, and it's about law and order, and it's about people having individual freedoms and having state sovereignty to crack down on crime however they want. Plays out wonderfully for them. In 1992, Bill Clinton and Al Gore, the first and only ever ticket to have 2 Southern Baptists on it, win the presidency. So the Dems run another Southern governor, and they double down on Southernness in this. They win an election. They win re-election in 1996. And in 2000, George W. Bush wins the presidency as a Texan because Florida comes in and they are able to win through the contested electoral count in Florida, a Southern state, a former Confederacy state. And who were the voters that lost their voting rights and didn't have their votes counted? They were the voters, they were African-American voters in Broward County. They were not counted. It's the Southern dominance, white dominance, through disenfranchisement, whatever means necessary, and the Supreme Court upholds it. Bush wins the popular vote in 2004 on the strength of Southern states. So if we go back to 1963, when Lyndon Johnson becomes president, through 2008, when George W. Bush is done being president, what we have is 45 years of Southern presidents. They're either from the South. Actually, they are from the South, and they all have a Southern kind of affinity, a Southern worldview, a worldview in which the cause that was noble is one of Southern white dominance that can be conveyed and portrayed and saned, not through overtly racial acts, but through coded ways of talking about the world, individual freedoms, the fight against federal tyranny, which usually means the support of Black or brown people, and the production of heritage, traditions, and ways of life, such as allowing universities to segregate in their dormitories, or allowing states to adopt voting laws, and the counting of votes in ways that suppress Black votes. 45 years of Southern presidents. It's a really stunning thing. And the only way it happens is because George Wallace shows the way. George Wallace shows the way that you can take this powerful lost cause ideology that came to dominate this country through the strategic actions of all these associations, through their institutionalization, through their narrative, through their textbooks, through their actions, and the abdication of a response to this by the federal government, by Northern whites, allowed this to take hold. And so Lyndon Johnson gets this done on the Civil Rights Acts in his time, which is the equivalent of the 1948 desegregation of the armed forces and the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. And Wallace personifies the never again. Segregation now, tomorrow, and forever, even though you pass these laws. I can go and I can run. I can run for the presidency. I can win these southern states. I can probably get success outside of them. All of these people win the presidency with either the Southern strategy or a Southern alignment until 2008. And in 2008, we have a cataclysmic moment. We have the election of a Black man for the presidency from Illinois, a state that by this point in time has become synonymous with Northern identity, with Chicago, with the kind of high education and success and attainment and power of Black Americans. Barack Obama breaks the system, just like Truman and the Brown court decision, and Lyndon Johnson broke the system. It broke the white supremacy system. It was the rupture in the lost cause mindset that the Northern white dominance was the right way to go. And in the 1960s, Wallace was the response, followed by 45 years of Southern presidents. The last lecture tomorrow is the response of Make America Great Again, MAGA Nation, to Obama's election and to the associated expansion of power to communities of color and to women in our society. That's it for tonight. Wallace provides the template. We'll call it the playbook. And I think that's an apt term to use because that's the terminology that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have used to refer to the Project 2025 manifesto and description as a playbook for how it is they want to go forward. And today, Trump was asked, what's the first thing that you're going to do if you become president? And he said he's going to appoint the guy who wrote Project 2025. He said that's the first thing he's going to do. So I'm going to see if you have any questions. I just opened the chat. I see that I had not opened it before because I got here and I ran right into the lecture. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'm happy to sit here for a minute or two and see if you have any questions. Otherwise, I appreciate you on hanging with me and coming in, let me coming in late and coming through this content. It to me is the way in which I'm understanding today in America. Carol, your question just now is the question of, did Trump understand this, or was it just his strategist? So the question again is, does Trump know what he's doing and understand all this, or is it his strategist? That's a question I get a lot. It's a question that people ask. And I believe that Trump intuitively understands racial animus and division and how to leverage that for his personal, economic, and emotional status. He's been doing it for decades. That's where I'm going to start the lecture tomorrow. And so he has this very, very fine-grained, we'll call it radar or sensibility of how to see these divisions and these currents. And he is spectacular at kind of finding grievances and resentment by white Americans, particularly white men, and leveraging it. So is he aware of this? I think at a fundamental level, he has an approach to the world that is tried and true, and he knows he's going to continue with it. And it goes way back to his father, his lawyers, and through his time in New York. And so I think that he fundamentally knows that these are the pieces to leverage and to utilize. And he has utilized them. What is happening right now is I think he isn't able to account for the fact that there's eventually these techniques can meet their match when people rise up. And that's what happened with the civil rights movement. And that's maybe what's happening right now. But I think that he fundamentally, at some deep psychological level, gets it intuitively in the same way that an abuser understands how to abuse and how to manipulate people in their orbit. They can't always tell you about what's going on and why they do it, but they just know to stand a certain way, to cry at a certain moment, to show fake vulnerability at certain times, to at other times be aggressive and to exact pain. And I think Trump does get that at some deep level and does kind of like drive the car to those places and in those ways. Does he understand how it is that it necessarily can play out in terms of the actual maneuvering of strategy? I do not think he understands that. If he did, he would have much more strategy to how he's campaigning and how he campaigned in 2016 and how he's campaigning now. He's doing a number of things strategically that really hurt his cause. He was able to overcome them in 2016, could not overcome them in 2020. And is struggling to overcome them in 2024. So I don't see great strategy in what he does. I see a great intuitiveness, an ability to feel and understand where there's weakness and pain, and then to like push to exact it for his benefit without any concern about the country or about anybody else. And I think that is an incredible skill set that is used for evil. What Wallace did is actually less reprehensible to me. Wallace, later in his life, changed his policies and who he was as a public politician. I have no idea what was in his heart or in his mind, really. But as a politician, he adapted his policies and came to change them so that he eventually gains the votes of many Black Alabamians when he serves as governor at 4 different times. Trump, not going to do any of that because he just knows one way to go. So to me, that's where it's less thought out. With Wallace, he was very smart and made a decision to change who he was in order to win election. And I think that his ability to adapt that to a national audience was also very strategic and effective. So to me, I understood what the game Wallace was playing. It had terrible consequences, but I understand it. With Trump, there is just an inability to kind of deal with that level of pain causing and moral damnation that he just doesn't is not shamed by, is not troubled by. Yeah. So we'll talk about Trump at length on tomorrow night. I always think about like a week from now, but I wanted to pack all these together, and people are watching. Many of you are watching these on recordings, I know. So thank you all so much tonight. I really appreciate it, and I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow night. And keep the faith, folks. We're winning, and we're going to win. I think we got to keep working and keep our eyes on the prize. All right. Good night.